Welcome to a new episode of the Animal Liberation Hour, brought to you by Animal Activism Mentorship. Our goal is to share remarkable stories of resilience, creativity, and dedication among activists in the animal liberation movement. We are honored that you tune in every week to join us in being inspired by the impassioned guests we have on our show. It's important to AAM's mission as a free multinational program that we support and uplift aspiring and seasoned animal rights activists alike. From one-on-one mentorships, free workshops and trainings, to this podcast, we hope to empower humans to take action and turn our vision for a kind world towards all animals into a reality. Today, I chatted with collective liberation activist and vegan content creator Iye Bako. Iye was born in Nigeria and immigrated to the United States with her family, where she currently lives. She embarked on her plant-based journey through her motivation to nurture and nourish her body. And that was her gateway into the vegan and animal rights movement. Since going vegan 5 years ago, Iye has been using her growing platform to advocate for the animals. Her goal is to help aspiring activists from cultures and communities similar to her own feel seen and inspire them to take action for the animals. She's deeply passionate about social justice, exploring the intersection of human and beyond human animal rights, and voraciously advocates against all forms of oppression. It is my great pleasure to bring you the delightful Iye Bako. It is such a pleasure to have you on the Animal Liberation Hour, Iye. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us today.
It's my pleasure, and thank you so much for having me on.
Oh, of course. I know some listeners of this podcast are probably quite familiar with me being an avid listener of other podcasts, especially when it has to do with animal rights. And my interest happens to be on topics that are not very often talked about, or topics that might be uncomfortable to some but are really important and need to be had in the movement to make ourselves better, more effective, and how we can be our best selves advocating for others who are marginalized and oppressed, regardless of the species they are. And that's sort of how I came across your work, your ideas, your wisdom, and just the way that you've addressed a lot of questions that I had, which it was just so eloquent and well thought out that I've just been following you ever since. And I'm very grateful for the work that you did. So before we do get into all the questions, I just want to thank you for all those who you have inspired and are going to continue to inspire.
That means a lot to me. Thank you.
Yeah, no, of course. So one of the areas that, we like to emphasize on within our program of animal activism mentorship is to provide an opportunity for up-and-coming activists and seasoned activists to find commonality in their stories. And this can be from their origin story of what drew them into animal rights, or certain challenges that they've come across along their paths. So I would love for you to share your story and what kind of sparked your journey into becoming active for the animals.
What brought me into this space initially was eating a healthier plant-based diet, because my dad has chronic health issues stemming from a stroke to cancer and many other issues that led me to watch a documentary called Forks Over Knives. And from there, I started going in a transition from omnivore to vegetarian. And while I was going through the vegetarian phase, fully intending to go whole food plant-based, I was just doing my own research online, and I stumbled across a YouTube video called Dairy is Scary by Aaron Janus. And it's a 5-minute presentation about all the horrific things in the process of what it takes to get dairy milk. I was never really a big cheese eater, but for the simple fact of taking milk from another animal that we don't need and seeing them go through such horrific suffering, I couldn't bear to spend my money on that. And I immediately became vegan that very same day. Initially, it was for my own consciousness that I didn't want to lower my vibration by, consuming the dairy milk that is stolen from, cows and given to humans and taken away from their babies. Basically, I didn't want to be a part of that system. But then I went to an animal rights conference. Well, not technically just for animal rights. It was a veg fest local to where I live, actually out in Cleveland. And I listened to a presentation by Philip Wolin where he talks about the fact that going vegan is addition, but becoming an activist is multiplication. And that concept really resonated with me because I wanted to, slink away in the corner and eat my salad and tofu and not really spread the message. And then I was like, well, man, there's so many horrible things happening to beyond human persons that I can't just, slink away in a corner anymore. I have to go out and spread the word. So that's what sparked the journey.
I love everything about that. And I also I hope Eloisa is proud of us for using her terminology of beyond human persons. And you came at it from the health perspective, which, sometimes there's this idea of, oh, if you're doing it for health, you're not really in it for the animals, which, I can see some reasoning behind that thought process. But for you, it's so different because you actually did more research. And then once you connected with the ethical and moral side of the argument for choosing not to consume certain products, it sort of became a no-brainer for you. And just going off of that, do you think it was easier for you to make that ethical connection because you had already, for lack of a better term in the moment, quote unquote, given up certain products? So it was easier for you to justify continuing down that trajectory?
Absolutely, which is why I think it's such a shame when some vegans say that people who have started for the environment or for health reasons can't call themselves vegan. But I also think at the same time that you have to make the connection to the moral and ethical issues. But I don't think the vehicle that you join the movement really should be a deterrent. And I don't understand the philosophy of saying that don't come into the movement because you didn't first learn about the animals. I think when I was, vegetarian, aiming towards being plant-based for my, holistic health reasons, I was like, this is easy to just give up dairy because that's the only thing I have left in my diet. So I think that absolutely played a role in why it was easy for me to become an ethical vegan.
Yeah, that's a very important point. And that's something that we talk about when doing other forms of activism as well. For example, at a fur protest or a circus protest, we're not having a barrier of entry being you have to be vegan in order to come and protest this form of exploitation. It's if anyone wants to speak up, we need to create a space where they're welcome to do so. And along the journey, they're probably more likely to make that connection if they care about a certain form of exploitation of certain species. Then it would, at least, from a commonsensical perspective, make sense that they're probably more likely to expand that awareness to other species. So I really appreciate you bringing that point in. And from your outlook has to do a lot with collective liberation, and you speak so wonderfully about that. And I wonder how the animal rights movement can strengthen that message, but also not compromise on providing these beyond human persons their own space or their own movement. Because one side of the argument is we need a collective movement because in this particular scenario, those who are being oppressed are not the ones fighting for their liberation. It's others outside who are fighting for their liberation. So that in and of itself offers so many nuances. So then there's this idea of if we talk about other social justice issues, that's in a way taking away from the animals are losing their own movement. So what rebuttal would you have to that argument, and what case would you make, or what clarification would you make for centering collective liberation while also not taking away from the issue of animal abuse and exploitation?
What I would say to that is that there's no social justice issue that exists in a vacuum. We're dealing with systems of oppression, and people are otherized. And I'm thinking not just human persons, but animal persons as well are otherized because of the way they look, because of their features, because of their abilities, disabilities, sexuality, background, all of these types of things. The otherizing of other bodies, it all stems from patriarchy, it stems from homophobia, it stems from racism and all of these systems of oppression. So you can't say we're just going to separate speciesism out of this system and not touch on all of the others, because they're woven together like a fabric. So if you pull one thread, you pull on all the other threads. And people, sometimes think that there's a limitation in how much human beings can, prioritize, and how much, we can speak on one issue and still give attention to another issue, and that there's going to be some sort of give and take in the process. And, I have my issues with that, because I think that, on one hand, there is such a thing called burnout, but we're not saying you need to go out and protest, women's rights on Monday, racism on Tuesday. And we're not saying you're going to have these like focuses and you're going to dedicate 100% of your time on these days of the week to these issues. What we're really saying is that when you're advocating for animals, don't duplicate the systems of oppression that exist in society while you do that. So while you're speaking in, how do you say this? You're not speaking on behalf of the animals, but you're being more of like an ally or an accomplice with the animals in their fight for justice and liberation. While you're doing that, don't be fat phobic, don't be transphobic, don't be all of the other, isms and phobias while you're doing those things. And when there's an opportunity to speak out for a human rights issue, speak out, because a lot of times in the movement, I've heard things like, I went to a protest and the people there refused to honor my pronouns. Well, that's not being an ally to, the LGBTQ plus or, non-binary community. So when you're dealing with other human beings, be respectful of who they are and be respectful of their backgrounds. That to me is interconnected, oppression right there. That to me is collective liberation, is to honor the non-human persons and the human persons at the same time. We're not saying that every struggle is like a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday thing that leads you to burnout, but you can prioritize whichever issue you want. There's this other thing that it's like, if you're a human rights activist and your main focus is anti-racism, that you can't be anti-racist and be a vegan and a vegan activist at the same time. Maybe you're someone who, you have a burning passion, you're affected by racism, so you have to speak out against it. You can be vegan in the background, but you don't have to make veganism your main, priority and focus. But like while you're advocating for human rights and someone asks you about, your lifestyle and what you eat, as people inevitably always ask you why, and then you say, well, it's about my philosophy. I believe in collective liberation. I don't want to, speak out for human rights while oppressing other animals as well. So those conversations are inevitable. Like I said before, if you're pulling on a thread of the systems of injustice, you're pulling on the whole fabric. So I don't think that there is a trade-off. And people saying that there is a trade-off are really misunderstanding the point. And I'm also not saying that you need to advocate for every single issue every day. It's just when things arise, speak up.
Wow, yes, that is so beautifully said. And I love the visual of when you pull on the thread, you pull on the whole fabric. And that is, I think in a way, when you think of it as all oppression being interconnected, what we realize is that the systems of oppression, the quote unquote powers that be that are marginalizing and oppressing different communities, there's a commonality there. And so if you disrupt one, you disrupt all. And that should provide a ray of optimism in that it's not we have to take it down one by one, because there is going to be a domino effect. And
absolutely,
yeah, it's not going to be a tangible effect if there's going to be a lot of infighting. And that's something that when you think of those who are profiting off of animal abuse and exploitation, I don't think they're, spending as much time infighting as those who are trying to liberate them are. So imagine how powerful the movement would be if we all came together and acknowledged our diversity, celebrated that, came together, and used our own creative talents to liberate animals, because there's not one single way to achieve that.
Absolutely. And I'll just add one more thing really quickly. And that is the line that people use in the animal rights movement a lot, that other animals are the most oppressed. And I take issue with that because I believe that there's no such thing as a hierarchy of oppression. And the reason why I believe that is because, like you said before, there's no order that we have to go in. We can do all of these things at once because there's so many people on this planet and everyone has different talents and different focuses. And we can all focus on different things with the common goal in mind. So to say other animals are the most oppressed is to say that people who are oppressed are not experiencing it the worst. And you don't live in everyone's body. You don't walk in everyone's shoes. So you don't know what it is that they're experiencing. And watering it down by using that type of terminology actually deters them from wanting to be in the movement.
Right. That's a very important point that you bring up there. And it's not about, walking on fine glass, making sure that no one is offended. That's not what we're saying. It's the idea of just we're here fighting for these beings who are oppressed. That's a fact. And the fact that we care enough, we care so deeply that we want the entire world to go vegan like that. Because, we all come at it, like once we make that connection, we have that realization and we're like, oh, once everybody knows, they're going to make the switch because it's so obvious. But then when we realize that that's not the case, it can be frustrating. And the urgency of the issue, the scale of suffering can get in the way of connecting with our empathy and making that connection with other people, which I so understand and I am very guilty of more often than not, because again, we think of the animals and we're like, it takes over. And then you need to, like you talk about burnout, I think this has a lot to do with that, taking a step back. And if we want to be effective, how can we do that? And how can we advocate for that kindness and respect and compassion that we are really championing for these animals, but also personify that in how we show up in this world.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So for you talked about that the phrase of activism is a multiplicative effect. So once that really resonated with you, how did you feel called to show up as an activist?
When I initially got into activism, I looked into who were the people in my neighborhood, in my area, who were already doing activism, because I had absolutely no idea about how to go about it. And so, I found some local meetup groups and, Facebook groups of people who were doing activism. And I first started out by going to, protests and rallies and marches, with my sign, which is a great form of activism. And then I also did, outreach where we talked to people in person and, gave them information. And, it was more of like, changing people's minds individually type of activism. And for a while, it was going okay. But I also felt like I wasn't duplicating the type of results that I wanted to see. I realized that I was planting seeds, but you don't get to see like the people change, like come to fruition when you're doing street activism. Well, sometimes you do in street activism because sometimes you can convince people right on the spot, but not so much as like at marches and protests and things like that. And the powerful tool that is the internet really spoke to me to like put my voice online, because I'm someone who, I like to be creative. I'm a creative person. I like to make art. I like to write. And I feel like I expanded my reach and my audience by, taking my message to social media. And I know, partly I was inspired because of the presence that was on, YouTube and things like that of other activists. But the problem I had and the issue I had was that none of them looked like me. So I wanted to be that vessel and that voice for people who looked like me to be attracted to come into this movement.
Yes, I am. That I really want to touch on that more. And as you talked about, not finding people who look like you in the social media space doing your form of activism, was that also your experience when you were doing on the ground protests and outreach? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Absolutely. It was usually, one or two other Black people there. I was more than likely the only one. If there was another person, it was just like my really good friend, Krishna, who's Indian, or one of our friends that lives out in Dayton, which is, pretty far from where I live, but he always came up to Columbus, Ohio for protests. But it was typically, one or two other brown people, but not very many.
Right. And how did that inform your experience in these spaces? When did you find that you were attracting a certain demographic while doing outreach who came to you with questions, or did you notice any difference from how you felt you showed up in these spaces as well? Or
Well, I grew up in Ohio, so I'm pretty used to being like the only Black or brown person in the room. So it didn't really catch me off guard initially. But after a period of time, I was searching for community because I wanted to talk to people about animal rights and how I was feeling about, outreaching and things like that with people who shared similar life experiences as me, and how we, deal with our families and things like that. So I was kind of missing that community aspect of people who understand me at a more intimate level. And that's not to say that there was anything, wrong with being in a group of activists that were majority white, folks, but I just wanted to have that deeper connection of shared life experiences to take my activism journey even further.
mm-hmm. Yeah, I appreciate that insight that you offered there. And when you took a form of activism that connected with you via, the arts and writing and social media, how were you surprised by the response or the search for community that people like you were also seeking? And how did that make you feel that you were offering that safe space for them? Or did you feel that at all?
I definitely felt that because when I first started, speaking, with my own voice and not just sharing other people's posts on my account, I started to attract a large following. My account before was just, for, friends, family, and, people who came by here and there. But I started to have like a duplication effect when I started, putting my own voice and message out there. And even more so when I started sharing images of myself, people could really resonate, to the fact of being a brown person or a marginalized person in the animal rights space. And a lot of people actually told me they were looking for my type of voice and they were looking for someone like me. And I feel like I accomplished my goal of being that vessel for people that I didn't have coming into the movement. So I definitely did, pay attention and notice the volume of people who were coming in and how they were resonating with my message.
Totally. And when you talk about that kind of impact that you can have on other people, I get curious about if that puts some sort, do you take on some sort of pressure in that you need to show up in a certain way for these people? And how do you balance that with your own mental and emotional well-being? This is kind of for my own curiosity, because I'm just always excited to learn about activism, mental health, or people talking about that more, because I really wish that was a more normalized conversation, and that's something that we want to prioritize at AAM as well. So I know you're also a champion of activism, mental health, and so I think you're a wonderful person to speak to this issue.
Yeah, I think that there's always a pressure to show up for people the way you think that they need you to show up for them. And the way I got around from that is just understanding my own limitations and personal boundaries, which is that being a vegan and being an activist is a part of who I am, but it's not all of who I am. It's not my identity. So I take breaks from social media activism in the sense that I'm just going hard for like animal rights by showing up online as myself and showing different facets of my personality, my hobbies, my activities, and things like that. Because like for me, sharing, my self-care routines and sharing like what I like to cook and how I like to spend time and hang out and things that I like to do, it gives me that mental rest because going hard for activism is really challenging. And I think a lot of people get burnt out really easily because it's not everyone who is cheering you on while you do activism. In fact, quite the opposite is true. You get a lot of haters from it. So I think showing up, completely authentically and showing different parts of my life has actually helped me with my mental health because it's given me a space to like still be present, but at the same time be there for myself and in my community in the way that makes me most comfortable.
I love that. And activism in and of itself as a form of self-care and a mental health break it's really wonderful that you've found ways that's effective for you. And I think several of our listeners, myself included, can resonate with finding different ways to get a break and doing something that's fulfilling, makes you feel good, and is also has a positive effect on what you're trying to do. And you also speak of your Nigerian heritage, and I've followed the vegan Nigerian and the Canadian African on Instagram, and I have been on a huge phase of looking into West African food and cuisines, and they're so delicious. And I want to talk to you about, well, I wish I could talk to you about the cuisine for the rest of this conversation, but we're going to talk about culture and how the ethics of veganism fits into culture, and how if you've had to navigate addressing that your beliefs does not mean you're compromising on your heritage as a Nigerian person. So I would love to talk to you about that and your experiences.
For a lot of people, I know that their grandma's cooking, their auntie's cooking, their mom's cooking is something that, if you don't get that dish at, a holiday, at Christmas, at Easter, or Thanksgiving, there's some relatives that might take that as disrespect, and not only disrespect for your family, but disrespect for your culture. But my family, food ties do not run like that deep in that sort of way. My mom, when I first went vegan, she was really happy for me because I started this as a plant-based journey. And so my mom always understood that, she wanted me to be healthy and it was for preventative health reasons. So I'm lucky in a way that I came into this movement from that angle, because no one ever questioned my diet, because, my dad suffers from severe chronic health issues. So everybody was in alignment with me eating more plant-based. I think like culture-wise, we come from a small, town where fishing is very common. Throughout history, fish is always thought to be like a healthy food. So, when I first went vegan, my mom was like, you can eat fish, it's healthy. Like there's always like that white meat is better for you. Fish aren't really animals type of thing. So every once in a while she forgets and offers me fish, but she's really understanding of the fact that like I don't eat any animals. And she's really happy that I eat plant-based for health reasons. She's not really sold on the animal rights reasons as much, but she does understand it from an environmental impact way. But she doesn't really think that my offset is that much compared to what she likes to do, which is planting trees in Nigeria. So we don't really have too many discussions about like how eating plant-based takes away from our culture. In fact, quite the opposite. Where we're from in Nigeria, they eat majority plant-based because meat is really expensive, but it's not to be confused with veganism. They're not eating mostly plant-based because it's because of respecting other animals and other forms of life. It's just simply out of their reach economically. So people eat a lot of corn, yams, cassava, fruits and vegetables. They make, as you've seen, a lot of like pounded yam and fufu, and plantains are very abundant, different varieties of beans and soup dishes and rice. So we have a variety. It's the tropics, basically. We're from the fruit basket of Nigeria, so, or the bread basket, however you want to call it, of Nigeria. The land and the area that we live specifically, because Nigeria has different terrains, is very green and very fertile. So our ancestors are farmers. In fact, my mom was a farmer growing up, so eating plant-based for her is very natural, even though we have this thing in many, cultures that grew up impoverished, to where if you're an immigrant and you come to the US, you want to eat more meat because it's like you can finally afford it. So it's hard to get my mom to eat, more closer to her culture and eat plant-based. And I'm just like, just replace the meat with like beans and mushrooms and things like that. She's thought about it, but she hasn't taken that leap yet. But she doesn't feel like the way I'm eating is a disrespect or anything to our culture. One of the things we've talked about doing is like collaborating on like veganizing some of her recipes, which she's very busy, so we haven't gotten a chance to do that. But one of these days we'll collaborate, and I'll share it to social media.
That will be so fun, and that you can have your hidden agenda of making her go vegan too.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, that's so fun. I love seeing collaborations where, those in the plant-based community are recreating their cultural childhood favorites, and they get together with either their mom or grandma, and like they recreate plant-based versions of dishes. And it's just really fun to see that, okay, like this shows that to eat plant-based, to eat more plants, to leave animals off the plate does not mean you're saying no to your culture or where you came from. And you can still have that same family connection if that's important to you, in regardless of your lifestyle. And here we're doing it by putting kindness on the plates. So that's really wonderful that you address that. And I'm very excited for the prospect of seeing more fufu and stew dishes in the interwebs. Yeah. So have you visited Nigeria since going plant-based and since becoming an ethical vegan or identifying as an ethical vegan?
I did once before the pandemic, so that was 2017.
Mm-hmm.
And I went for a few weeks, and it was very easy to eat plant-based. I mean, the only challenges that I had was like long distance road trips, but I don't think it would have mattered being vegan or non-vegan because it's the way that the train is, there isn't very many rest stops. So it's like, I mean, it's a matter of like what you pack on the road with you. When we made stops to like, food stalls and stuff like that, like I would get like, coconut, and I would just eat like bananas and things like that. And funnily enough, bananas aren't like my favorite fruit to eat, like just plain, but like I just had to get energy and calories and just eat something. So like I did eat some fruits that weren't really my favorite. But other than that, like people always say, like, isn't it so, hard to be vegan in X, Y, and Z country? It's not really hard. You do have to make some adjustments and some sacrifices and like, very, very rarely like skip a meal if there's absolutely nothing. But like, for the majority of people who are healthy, so I would never advise doing something that's a health risk, but for the majority of people that are healthy, you can miss one meal and still be okay.
Yeah. No, I understand that. And, I'm sure we all get that question of if you were stranded on a desert island with, I don't know, some species of animal, like, would you eat them? And it's like, we'll worry about that when we get there, It's like once you're in that position, you always just figure it out. Like, eat the animal or eat an unripe banana. I'll go with the banana,
Yeah, exactly.
And just being there, how are you separating feeling like you need to do, or do you ever feel the need to do advocacy or educational outreach when you're in spaces with family who are not ethical vegans or who don't connect with the animal rights message? Is there any challenge that you might personally feel when you're not necessarily agreeing with what they choose to consume?
So for me personally, and this is not like to generalize activism or activists,
Sure.
I just have my own personal philosophy, and that is when people are eating, that's the worst time to bring up animal rights because they're completely not open-minded at that point because they feel like it's a personal attack that you're telling them that what they're consuming in that very moment makes them a bad person. And they're not looking at it from a systemic oppression, perspective. And the fact that it's like, no, it's not just you eating that one piece of chicken. It's like the 75 billion, land animals that are slaughtered. I mean, that number changes all the time, but that are slaughtered every year for human consumption, and majority is wasted. Like the food waste issue in the world is the most prominent issue, second to just, consuming them for food. We're actually discarding their poor bodies. So no, when I'm at meals with my family, I don't really bring it up. If someone does ask me at a meal, like, why are you eating that and not eating what everyone else is eating? I'll tell them it's because I'm vegan and I don't eat animals. And then if they ask me a follow-up question, well, why don't you eat animals? And I'm like, oh, because I don't believe that I should be eating animals when there's other things that I could eat that would make me perfectly, happy and healthy. But if you want to get into more details, we can talk about it after you're finished eating, because if you say anything, to the effect of, I don't eat animals because I believe it's immoral and unethical and things like that, they feel like you're attacking them as an individual, which you're not. It's that they weren't the first person to eat an animal. Over 95% of the world eats animals. And while I don't believe it's ethical, it's not like, I'm not saying people who eat animals as individuals are unethical. It's the system of consuming, other bodies as forms of sustenance when there's other options that's unethical. It's basically everybody's problem. It's not an individual problem and calling someone, a bad name or anything like that. So for me personally, the way I do activism with my families, I answer their questions. And if they don't ask me anything, I don't tell them anything because I don't believe necessarily that convincing people one-on-one is the best strategy that we have.
Yep. I mean, it is a tactic that could work sometimes, but again, probably the dinner table is not the best place to try it out. But yeah, like well, yeah, we are all part of a system, but again, for the scale of change that we need, like you said, it's not going to be the single solution that's going to work. Yes, if some people are genuinely interested in having that conversation, like you said, let's finish our meal and then we can talk about it more if you're interested. That way, it's a less risky space to poke anyone's buttons. But when we are also mindful of addressing, like, yes, we as one person might not be able to change the entire system, but when we all collectively come together, that's where the power is. And system change and individual change need to happen. And yeah, just finding opportunities and smart opportunities to spread the message is also key. And something that I've been thinking about quite a bit within the conversations of collective liberation, inclusivity in the animal rights movement, and it's also a topic that I've tried to create spaces of discussion for quite a bit, and it's yielded good conversation, but I feel like I'm still left with that, okay, so what's the solution? Because I'm just that kind of person who wants that, okay, this is the foolproof method that's going to work. And so for someone, having abstract answers isn't the most comforting to me, although I know we do live in a society that we just live in abstract answers all day, every day. But this specifically has to do with doing activism or educational outreach to people who are not within your own communities. So do you think there is a respectful way for someone to do activism and educational outreach to a member of another community who does not belong to their own community? And this is not necessarily in the case of, everything is fine and we're just doing outreach and leafletting. Not so much in that scenario, but when it has to do with a certain cultural practice that is causing a harm to another being. And at that moment, there might not be a representative from that community who is an animal rights activist to be able to facilitate that interaction. So in these kinds of situations, do you feel there's a respectful way to show up and do activism and advocacy? Did that make sense, or was that a very weirdly worded question?
No, I think it absolutely makes sense. Okay. And I even have my own concerns and questions and doubts about that, because it's what you mentioned already. We should first be looking for an ally or an advocate or an animal rights activist from that community to be the facilitator or the liaison. So what do we do when there isn't one and there's harm being caused to another individual? So that to me makes me wonder, why are we outreaching to these communities when there is a lot of harm being perpetuated to, non-human persons in this world? I question when activists go to remote areas, if we're speaking of the United States, into, Native American communities and advocate against the violence that they're perpetuating when there's worse violence happening in our own backyards. So I think the motivation matters, because maybe the person who is, an animal rights activist who's not part of the community lives in the area where that harm is being perpetuated. And as such, I would still think in my heart of hearts that before you do the activism, you need to get some sort of an ally from that community. They may not be vegan, they may not be an animal rights advocate, but before you advocate, to that community, the best way to make changes and to get people to be receptive is if you make allies from that community. And that doesn't mean you convert them to veganism, but maybe you help them to understand why those cultural practices are harmful and how there are better ways to go about, whatever it is, if there are better ways, because that's a big if, right? um I often see animal rights activists just like jumping the gun and being like, we need to like eradicate X, Y, and Z in indigenous practice. But in their own backyard, they have slaughterhouses and they have all of these other things going on. So it's like, why are you leaving your own community and the harm being perpetuated in your own community to speak up in other people's communities? So I think that intentionality really matters in that scenario.
Yeah. Yeah, that's I think that's a very practical way also of going about it. And yeah, it's in a way I'm relieved to hear that you've had similar questions and have thought about this. Clearly, you've thought quite extensively about this because um, as we do want to strengthen the movement and bring in more people who just want to create a better world, we also need to be thinking about how to be respectful and not turn off people from making positive change based off how we come across. So, yeah, I think just the idea of strong allyship goes a long way. To be able to just even have a presence and come to a space of understanding with those who might be participating in something that might not be within the ethical and moral circles of compassion that we're advocating for.
I definitely think that we need to make allies out of people and find the people who are doing work in those communities before we become saviors in those areas and say, we're the animal rights activists, we're here to, liberate, the animals in your area, but then we're not doing as much work in our own backyard.
You have so many remarkable insights and such well put together answers. And I'm so curious as to who are some mentors in your life who have inspired you to tap into that curiosity, to be coherent and logical and practical and kind and just a fierce liberationist all in one package when you answer questions. Like I would love to know if there were folks who inspired you to be the person you are today.
I really appreciate that. I'll definitely take that as a compliment. Initially, when I started, delving into the world of, collective liberation, it came from the idea didn't really come from me. It came from obviously the compassion that I have for, people and other animals, but it also just came from listening to a lot of podcasts early on. I don't really listen to as many podcasts now as I used to. But like, we're doing a podcast today. I'm sure, this is going to make a similar impact on people as it had on me back in those days when I was, early on in learning about collective liberation. Right. But there was the Bearded Vegans podcast that talked about intersectionality.
Yeah,
they
on their
do
podcast,
such a good job.
Right?
I was, yeah.
Yes, I love that episode. That was a great one.
Thank you so much. They do such a great job. So they really, had an impact and inspired me. And then there was a Vegan Warrior Princesses Attack, which they don't have that podcast anymore. But like, I've been vegan for over 5 years now. And, in the very beginning of my journey, they were very inspirational to me in talking about collective justice and collective liberation and having really unique guests on. And then I also learned a lot from AFCO and I read, both of their books. And, they have one called Afroism, which is like, essays about pop culture and veganism. And then they have another book that is
Racism and Zoological Witchcraft.
Correct. Yes.
That's on my list of books to read. Afroism was every sentence I had to read like 5 or 6 times to like really grasp it. And then once I got it, I would be, whoa, mind blown. So I'm really excited to read their next book.
Yeah, definitely do. So, those were like my early on influences. And then from there, it's just like, my ideas started spinning and my mind just started going and I started to do my own work. So I sometimes find inspiration in other people. Like, I don't know if you know, but you should. Christopher Sebastian is one of my close friends and big influences.
Oh my gosh. Christopher Sebastian is spectacular, phenomenal.
Yeah, he's so great. I definitely get inspiration from like my circle of people like that and my close friends, which happen to be like vegan and environmental you know rights and environmental justice advocates. Isaiah Hernandez,
Mhm.
queer brown vegan, is one of
Yes.
my really good friends. So like I take inspiration from my circle of friends, and then just like from my own thoughts and ideas and how I see the world.
Yes, all these people you've mentioned, I've learned of them through podcasts and started following them. I was like, oh my gosh, they're all so cool, and they're just so yeah, I just a part of me is like, oh, I love the small community, like people know each other, supporting each other, but I'm also really excited to see this grow and expand and take over the world.
Yeah, me as well. Thank you so much.
Yeah. So, I would love for you to uh, provide your 2 cents and advice for new activists, because we at Animal Activism Mentorship want to create a space for new activists who are trying to find their calling and their space within the animal rights movement. And whether they have been vegan for a long time, or they're new vegans, or and are very new to activism, or have been in activism for a while, at AAM we feel like there's always an opportunity to learn and grow and be inspired by one another. So I would love you to give us some EA words of wisdom.
I would say if you're new to activism or just need a fresh or new take, is not to focus specifically on the work of just animal rights. Get passionate about whatever topic sparks your mind. Like, for some people, they even come into the world of animal rights activism through the anti-racism space, which is something that AFCO mentioned a lot in their work, is the fact that you don't necessarily need to come into the work of animal rights through the work of other animal rights authors. But there's a lot of really good ideas in like related social justice issues that are really inspiring, because I'd really love to see the overlap of people taking inspiration from how the gay rights movement, or the women's rights movement, or the disability movement, and how they did their work and how that impacted and made changes in their communities, and take inspiration from them and apply it to animal rights. So I think like the main thing is getting out of the animal rights bubble. I think that's one of the biggest challenges we have, is the fact that we lack new and fresh ideas, but then we're swimming in other ideas from other movements all around us that I feel like are being underutilized.
Mhm.
So I think that would be like one of the main things. And like, if it's difficult for some people to find the way that these issues intersect and overlap, then maybe start out by looking at the work of Christopher Sebastian. I think that they do the work of bringing the issues together so well. Also, their name is Mexie, Mexie. They have a podcast, and they have tied the issues together so well. They're on YouTube. I've watched some of their videos where they talk about the direct comparisons between, animal rights and the disability movement and things like that. So I would, find these people online and figure out a way that you can merge the concepts that are impacting different, social justice movements, and apply it to veganism and animal rights.
Exactly. Yeah, I think I follow Mexie's podcast as well. I think it's now called the Total Liberation Podcast. I could be mistaken, but I'll be sure to link everything in our show notes. But all such great advice. And again, by seeking inspiration from these other movements, by having these conversations with other activists, we are not taking away from the animals. We are not ignoring the animals. We're not giving away their movement. It is still their movement, but that doesn't mean others can't come in and help us advance it, help us progress it. And that doesn't mean we can't show up in their spaces to help them with their movement as well, because like you said, it's all interconnected and we're all in a fight for a better world. So I love that so much. And I'm sure that we're going to have folks really inspired by you and all the work that you do. So how can they follow you? Are there any projects that you're involved with? Want to give us the scoop on that?
Well, right now I'm just really focused on my social media platforms. So I go by the same username on all of them, which is Iye Loves Life. And my first name is spelled Iye. So yeah, follow me on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok, your favorite, whichever is your favorite social media platform. And, that's where I do the majority of my work. And in the future, I'd love to launch like a blog and a YouTube. So look forward to that in the more distant future, but it is on my radar.
Well, we will keep an eye out for that, because I think that's going to be a fantastic resource for not just the vegan animal rights community, but for everyone. And before I let you go, my last question that I love to wrap up with: what does a just, equitable, and kind vegan world look like to you?
To me, it's a world where everyone is respected and treated fairly. And we can finally, go to like grocery stores and restaurants. And for me, I don't want to see just vegan items like paralleling non-vegan items. Like I want to see restaurants, mainstream restaurants, having fully vegan options. I think that they've started that in the UK. They have like a fully vegan Burger King. I'm like, keep it going. Like, obviously, we shouldn't rely on, green capitalism and vegan washing and things like that to be a solution, because we can't purchase ourselves out of the crisis that we've created. But not only that, we see vegan companies all the time where they don't pay their workers fairly and equitably. So I want the entire, chain of how the food gets to us to be fair and everybody to be compensated. Yeah. And for, more people to just catch on to the fact that we don't need to exploit other humans or other animals in order to, live a good life and to get nourishment and to, have fun and entertainment and all of these things. I believe in a world where it's not going to be perfect, but it's going to be a lot better than what we have now.
Thank you again so much, Iye. You are such a joy to speak with, and I'm looking forward to following your next projects and maybe pretty soon seeing your mom and yourself recreate some delicious dishes and saving animals while you're at it. So thank you again for sharing your wonderful thoughts and wisdom with our community today.
It's my pleasure, and thank you again so much for having me on.
Several of our episodes on the Animal Liberation Hour have included insightful discourse with our guests about how all oppression is connected and the importance of offering an inclusive space in the animal rights movement. I feel this conversation with Iye addresses several key points, especially about how the message of collective liberation does not necessarily take away from the animal rights movement. Because when we as a collective oppose all forms of oppression and show up in every space to fight against injustice, it brings us together and grows our community in a way that fosters compassion, empathy, education, and a healthy, constructive dialogue on how we can best attain our goals. It's an opportunity to showcase how our diversity doesn't divide us, but rather it brings us together, steadfast and stronger than ever before. As always, I will link Iye's social media handles in the show notes below so you can follow her and be inspired by her content. Before we sign off, please take a quick minute to rate and review the podcast. It helps others find it more easily, and the more people who find it, the more they can be inspired by the guests we interview and turn that into actionable change for the animals. Plus, if you have any guest suggestions for whom you'd like to see featured on our podcast, feel free to reach out to us on social media. We love hearing from you. Don't forget to check out our website, animalactivismmentorship.com, and follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube at Animal Activism Mentorship, where you can keep up with the podcast as well as all things AAM. Accessibility to our content without any hindrance is key to our work here at AAM. That's why it's important to us that we offer our resources for free. So if you like what we do at the Animal Liberation Hour and at AAM, and would like to support us, of course, given that you have the financial ability to do so, please feel free to contribute to our Patreon. It helps keep us going. AAM is proud and honored to be fueled by Farm Animal Rights Movement. One more reminder that you can sign up for a free mentor to help you with your activism at animalactivismmentorship.com. So if you are still waiting for that sign that you should be an activist for the animals, this is it. From July 29th till August 7th of 2022, we are hosting the Chicago Convergence. That is 10 power-packed days of badass actions against the fur industry and animal agriculture. We are also hosting the Ohio Occurrence in Cleveland, Ohio, from September 2nd till September 4th of 2022. Speaking from personal experience, these events have been so valuable in my journey as an activist. It's a great opportunity to meet others like yourself who are so passionate about taking action and speaking up for the animals. Plus, it's a heck load of fun. The link to Animal Activism Mentorship's Linktree will be in the show notes below. It includes all the information on registering for these different events. Whether you choose to attend one or the other, or both, it's important that you register so that we at AAM can best accommodate you and your needs. Now remember that it will take all of us to achieve animal liberation. And as my good friend and co-host Trey says, it is not a sprint, it is a marathon. So we've got to stay focused, stay positive, take care of ourselves, and be the change of compassion that we envision for this world. Until next time.